Hi everyone. For those who don't know me yet, I'm Monica Daley, and I am a professor at University of California, Irvine in the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology. And I'm also the director of the Integrative Movement Sciences Institute. I'm excited for this summer. It's an interesting time for us here at UCI because we haven't finished our spring term yet. So it's a little bit hectic because many of our Summer Institute partners are on the semester system and have already finished, but we're in the quarter system and we haven't yet finished. So it's been an interesting kind of transition period here where we're starting up workshops, but we haven't actually started projects yet. So if there are any trainees in the room who are doing projects at UC Irvine, you haven't heard from me much yet, but don't worry, you will before we actually get started. So today I proposed a very broad topic for the original title, and it's a little bit too big. Scaling is really generally the topic of considering how function changes with size, and we often use dimensionless quantities in the analysis of changing function with changing size. But since that's a very big topic that can be applied to many different problems, I'm really going to focus today on one area that is familiar to me because we do lots of studies of bipedal locomotion in our lab, and specifically bipedal locomotion in ground birds. So I'll be using some data sets from our own lab to illustrate principles of scaling in legged terrestrial locomotion, and using a data set on ground birds that we used from a big meta-analysis of the data available on ground birds from the literature. So these birds illustrated here are the study species that we have had in the lab at some point in time, ranging from little bobwhite quail and pheasants up to ostriches. Ostriches are pretty expensive and difficult to keep in the lab, so we don't have them anymore. We mostly work on guinea fowl, which are an intermediate sized bird. But okay, before we get started, for the trainees, you should go ahead and sign in. So please use this QR code to register your attendance as we get started. How long do I need to keep this up? I don't know. Let me know when you've got it. All right, let's see. I'm trying to arrange things here so I can see people. So if you have any questions as we go, please do feel free to just unmute yourself and speak up, or you can raise your hand, but I can't promise I'll be able to see everybody when you raise your hand because I'm sharing my screen. Okay. So a lot of the work we do starts at the whole animal level, trying to think about how animals move in terms of their whole body dynamics. And one of the questions that we have asked is, how does locomotion vary with body size? And among terrestrial mammals, size can range over a 10 to the 6-fold range from the tiniest shrews up to elephants. And so scaling has been used to try to understand how the mechanical demands of movement and function in terms of gait change with body size. But I'm not going to be able to address all of the scaling issues today. I'll try to give an overview of the general principles. And first, I wanted to kind of take a minute to think about what we already know about gait from our own personal experiences, because we spend a lot of our time moving about in the world, right? For those of you who, maybe this is like a generational thing, I don't know how many people in the room are familiar with Monty Python, but those of my generation at least will know this famous skit. You can look it up on YouTube, from Monty Python, about the Ministry of Silly Walks. And it's a pretty funny skit because it's a lot of physical comedy where people are just who are work in the Ministry of Silly Walks basically try to compete with each other for the silliest walk. And really it highlights how, there are many different possible ways to move that we don't use, right? And Yet, and in fact, people walk in very, very specific ways and run in specific ways. And there's only a few gaits that bipeds use, right? So if I show you even a snap of still shots of various bipeds, right here, you can look at a single image and often tell whether they're walking, for example, or running, right? So legged animals only move in a few specific ways, and these specific ways of moving are called gaits, right? Bipedal gaits, striding bipeds like humans typically use walking and running gaits, walking at slow speeds and running at higher speeds. And interestingly, if you look across very diverse species of bipeds, they use remarkably similar walking and running gaits. So you can see in this image from an old lab picture of a graduate student and an ostrich in the lab, right? And in the left picture, you can see from the still shot, two legs are in contact with the ground and they're in the middle of a walking gait. And on the right, you can see that there's an aerial phase and they're in a running gait. Now, if you actually just put a motion capture marker on the hip of an ostrich and the hip of a human and watched the motions, they would be remarkably similar, walking and running. You would not be able to tell whether it was an ostrich or a human if you just watched the center of mass motions during the gait cycle, right? So you can kind of see that despite the fact that we can move, it's possible to move in many ways, we actually typically move in very specific ways. And that suggests that the physics of the system play an important role in governing how we move, right? And in humans, we learn that through lots of experience. This is a still frame of my son Thomas about 9 years ago when he was learning to walk, right? Humans take hundreds of thousands of steps to learn to walk the way they do. But interestingly, ostriches can walk and run 24 hours after birth and yet use similar gaits as humans. So very different development, very different evolutionary histories, and yet we do converge as adults to similar gaits. So if we characterize the motions of walking and running, the classic way to characterize gaits is to look at foot contact patterns, but the modern way of looking at gaits is to consider the dynamics of the center of mass during the gait cycle. And so I'll talk a little bit about that. And in the two gaits that we are going to be talking about today, because it's relevant to the data set we'll be using, are walking and running gaits, right? Illustrating walking on the left, it's characterized by alternating right and left foot contacts. And in walking, there is a double support phase where both feet are in contact with the ground, right? One of the characteristic quantities that we use to characterize gaits is called duty factor, which is the ratio of stance duration to stride duration, where if the duty factor is greater than 0.5, that means that there's a double support period. And if the duty factor is less than 0.5, that means that there's an aerial phase when there are no feet in contact with the ground. And that is what characterizes running gaits, right? So we can see illustration of the foot contact pattern for running gait here, where there's still alternating right and left contacts, but there's an aerial phase between contacts. But it's not just the foot contact patterns that distinguish them. Walking is actually characterized by the dynamics of the center of mass, in which the body can be approximated as a point mass that is vaulting over a relatively stiff limb. In humans, we tend to lock out the knee, so the leg is relatively rigid and operates at a fixed length during the stance phase. And that results in dynamics of an inverted pendulum-like motion during the stance phase. And so we can look at the mechanical energy fluctuations of the center of mass during that stance phase. It would look like this, something like this graph here. This is from real guinea fowl data, where we're plotting, in this case, the gravitational potential energy in blue and the dashed line, and the kinetic energy of the center of mass in red, and they are alternating in out of phase. So as the leg vaults, when it first contacts the ground, it is at its maximum velocity, and then it converts kinetic energy to potential energy as it reaches its peak height mid-stance, and that's when the potential energy is highest, and then it reaccelerates and converts that potential energy back to kinetic energy in the second half of stance. So there's a passive energy exchange between the kinetic and potential energies due to this inverted pendulum-like motion, which helps to make the stance phase of walking very economical in that it doesn't require external mechanical work on the center of mass of the body. But as animals increase in speed, the magnitude of the kinetic energy is much, much greater than the magnitude of potential energy fluctuations in stance. And we get different energy fluctuation patterns. So typically in running is characterized basically as a bouncing motion rather than a vaulting motion. And what we find is it's like bouncing a mass on a spring. So in this case, the leg acts as a compliant element and center of mass height decreases during the stance phase rather than increasing. And so as a result, the body height being lowest at mid-stance means that now both kinetic energy and potential energy are decreasing during the first half of stance and increasing during the second half of stance. And this in-phase cycling of gravitational potential energy and kinetic energy means that there can't be an exchange between the two, but instead in running gaits, there is energy stored in the elastic springs, in the connective tissues like the tendons and ligaments and muscles of the limb, right? And so there's in-phase fluctuations of the external mechanical energies that are out of phase with energy stored in the spring, which isn't shown here because we can't typically measure it directly from external measures. So walking and running are characterized by these different dynamics. And they also, along with these different dynamics, have different ground reaction force patterns. So we can look at the ground reaction force patterns in these gaits. And in walking, this is typical of the walking gait. We see that there is a double support phase. This is a walking gait with a duty factor of 0.6. So there's about a 10% overlap in the contact periods. The vertical force fluctuates around 1 body weight. This is force in newtons divided by body mass times gravity to make it in multiples of body weight. And the fore-aft force is when the leg first comes into contact with the ground, there's a deceleration. And so that's the initial half of stance decelerating, and then there's a reacceleration in the second half of stance, shown here, okay? As animals increase in speed, the duration of contact decreases and the magnitude of the vertical forces increases to compensate because animals have to support their body weight against gravity in the vertical direction. So we have these characteristic forces in running. One thing to note is that when speed increases, the fluctuations in vertical force increase in magnitude, right? And the peak forces and the minimum forces, the peak forces increase and the minimum forces decrease. So these are examples of the characteristic ground reaction forces in running. I'm showing an example of grounded running because that's a gait that birds use. Humans actually don't use grounded running. We have an abrupt transition between walking and aerial running. We don't ever run with overlapping limb support, but birds actually do. And we can discuss some of the reasons that once we kind of talk about all of these principles, but it's an interesting observation that in particular, small ground birds use grounded running for most of their speed range. But in any case, points here to highlight are the peak forces increase in speed in a very predictable way that relates to the magnitude of forces required to support body weight and the duty factor associated with that gait pattern, okay? And so based on the empirical observations of the mechanical energy fluctuations and the force patterns, simple physical models for gait have been developed. And so the classic model that's been used to characterize running gaits or bouncing motion that are characterized by bouncing motions is the mass spring model, okay? And interestingly, this mass spring model can predict the ground reaction force patterns, not just for bipeds that have one limb in contact with the ground at a time, but also for multi-legged animals. If you approximate the entire system as a point mass with all of the legs acting together during a trotting gait type gait, all of the legs in contact act together as one virtual leg, right? And this mass spring model fits the ground reaction force magnitude, the fluctuations in peak force and their timing based on the body mass, gravity acting on that body mass in the vertical direction, and the specific contact geometries of the leg and their duration during stance. But in steady gaits, you can predict the magnitude of the forces based on simple physics, like very simple Newtonian physics, that over one complete gait cycle, the average vertical forces have to support body weight to maintain steady locomotion. And so we're considering the vertical direction as a ground reaction force in the y direction here. The average vertical force has to equal the mass of the body times g, and the horizontal fore-aft forces have to average out to 0 to maintain a steady speed. And so you can see an example of some real ground reaction force traces and the mass spring modeled ground reaction forces, which approximate the basic magnitude and timing very well, although it doesn't get all of the details right because it's such a simple model. So this model, although it's extremely simple, right, it's been used to demonstrated that it can characterize gaits over a diverse range of species with many different body sizes, many different legs. But in this simple case, this model only has one leg, right? And so the original versions of this model could not characterize walking gaits. And so a couple of decades ago, people started considering whether if you add a leg to the mass spring model, whether you can model walking gaits with similar dynamics, right? And so a paper by Geyer, Seyfarth and Blicken examined this by highlighting that although we characterize walking and running with separate dynamics, the inverted pendulum model does not fully predict the actual shape of the ground reaction forces that's observed in walking, right? A simple inverted pendulum that has no compliance would have ground reaction forces that look like the trace in red, but in fact, the walking forces have this characteristic M shape associated with it. And so what they did was developed basically a combination model, which you can think about as combining. So it's basically taking a mass spring model and adding 2 legs, and then considering how variation in contact conditions and leg stiffness can model multiple walking and running gaits. So this schematic figure here, shows the model that they used. It's a simple point mass with 2 legs. When in a single support phase of walking, there's only 1 leg in contact. And then it's illustrating different time points where in double support in walking, there's 2 legs in contact. There's a transition, and then there's a transition to another single leg contact. And what they found is that with different combinations of leg contact angle and leg stiffness, they can replicate the ground reaction force patterns for walking, okay? And so what this is saying is that walking is not strictly like an inverted pendulum. It's a spring-loaded inverted pendulum where there is some compliance in the leg as it contacts the ground. and to replicate the mass spring dynamics that we observe in human and other biped animal walking, you can replicate that characteristic M shape that's observed in experiments by varying different leg contact angles and the stiffness of the leg. And so this is just showing some characteristic sort of shapes that emerge from this model for different combinations. They all have the same total mechanical energy of the body, but they have different contact conditions and different leg stiffness conditions, which replicates different kinds of characteristic ground reaction force shapes that replicates some of the variation we see in gaits with speed as well. So these studies have shown that basically walking and running are characterized by a combination of inverted pendulum and mass spring dynamics, and that you can put them together as a spring-loaded inverted pendulum model that accounts for both of these dynamics and their coupling. So that's some background to try to kind of frame what the field thinks, how the field thinks about bipedal gaits. Now I want to turn to some actual data and observations from animals. And so we're interested in the question of how does movement change with body size? That question could be asked in the context of development. And there are some studies that have looked at changes in human gait with increasing size. This is an example of Edgar the ostrich at several weeks old and at 12 months old. You can see that the characteristic motions of the body generally look very similar, but obviously the small bird is operating its legs at a higher frequency and taking shorter steps because of its smaller size, right? And so we want to be able to rigorously analyze and compare, right, gaits between these animals. And so we need to think about how do we actually meaningfully compare animals of different size. We can also look at different species of different size. So these are videos of a bobwhite quail. I think the picture is technically a different kind of quail, but has a similar dingle whapper. And if you watch these videos for a minute, you might notice that there do appear to be some difference in the characteristics of movement between our small quail and an ostrich. The ostrich running tends to have a more vertically bouncy running gait, where the quail tends to have sort of a flatter trajectory, where it's using longer strides and sort of keeping its center of mass less bouncy in comparison, right? But we want to be able to rigorously compare this, right? And so I want to talk about some of the basics of scaling and how we build up the tools to rigorously compare that. And then we'll apply them to a data set on these birds, okay? All right, so one of the first principles that we need to consider when we're trying to compare animals of different size is the principle of isometric scaling. Or it's also called geometric similarity. I'm using a cube to illustrate this principle, but then you can imagine this is if you took a quail and you just, magnified it in size without changing its shape, right? Then how would all of the dimensions change, right? So when we think about isometric scaling, if we take the same cube, right, just to illustrate the concepts here, right, and we have a cube of length 1 in arbitrary units, and then we double its length, right, on all sides, and consider how that changes the cube, right? It will have length of 2 on all sides, right, the larger cube. When we consider cross-sectional areas, that would be taking a length times a width, right? And that's going to be length squared. So the one with twice the length will have 4 times the cross-sectional area. And then if we consider volume or mass, if we consider the mass to be proportional to volume, if we assume that all vertebrates are made of similarly dense tissues, right? Then the cube that has twice the length, the the volume is the length times the width times the height. And that is then therefore length cubed, which is 8. And so this is a fundamental challenge of getting bigger, that mass scales much more rapidly than cross-sectional area. So if we take the ratio of cross-sectional area to mass for this simple example, right, the larger cube has half the ratio, right, because we can consider the cross-sectional area increasing with length squared, the volume increasing as the length cubed, and the ratio of cross-sectional area to mass as 1 over length with increasing size here. Why is this a problem? Well, strengths in musculoskeletal tissues are, strength is proportional to the cross-sectional area, which scales with length squared. Loading is proportional to body mass, which scales as length cubed. And so the ratio decreases with increasing size, meaning that if animals get larger without changing shape, they become relatively weaker, right? So as animals get larger, they will be placing relatively higher stresses on their tissues unless they do something to change their shape to compensate for this. And so this is one of the reasons that it has been observed that there's actually a significant change in posture with body size. I won't get into all of the details of that, but this has been observed across mammals as well as birds. Weight scales much faster than strength, and this posture aligns the large animals have a more upright, straight-legged posture, which aligns the bones in the vertical direction. That helps to support body weight and reduce the muscular effort required to stand upright. And so we know that posture changes. So that raises a question, do they actually maintain functionally or dynamically similar movements? And how can we characterize that? So we've covered geometric scaling, but to address whether they function in a similar way, we need a theory that actually considers the dynamics of movement. And so Alexander in the 70s and 80s developed the dynamic similarity hypothesis for understanding locomotion. And this was also, variations of this have been used to analyze, to develop the mass spring model that I introduced to you earlier, right? So the dynamic similarity hypothesis is that if locomotor function remains this constant, then size-related differences will disappear once the data are normalized to dimensionless values using a standard set of characteristic physical quantities. And so what we need to do is decide what the appropriate set of characteristic physical quantities are for legged terrestrial locomotion, okay? And so based on these papers, they highlight these characteristic dynamics of walking like an inverted pendulum and running like a bouncing mass spring system. And all walking and running gaits can be considered a combination of spring-loaded inverted pendulum dynamics, a coupling between those two modes of motion. And so we can think about what the characteristic physical quantities are for these dynamics, okay? If we think about just the inverted pendulum for a minute, the angular frequency of a pendulum is related to the square root of G over L, the length of the pendulum. In this case, the length is leg length. And if we wanted to calculate a characteristic stance period, then it's going to be the inverse of that, right? So the period of the pendulum is going to be related to 2 pi square root of L over G, okay? So that's one characteristic physical quantity for this system, and it relates to leg length and gravity, okay? So we probably want to use that in our standard set of characteristic physical quantities, right? Now we can consider, if we consider the mass spring system, we have to think about the resonance of the characteristic bounce of a mass spring system. And the equation for the characteristic frequency of a mass spring system is related to the stiffness of the system, square root of the stiffness of the system divided by its mass, okay? And so if we think about, if we want to characterize one stance period, that's actually a half cycle of a resonance bounce, because we were talking about here a half cycle. Then you take this half of this quantity, so you have the characteristic stance period should relate to pi times the square root of body mass over k vert, right? So the characteristic stance period is the inverse of this. So we have body mass is an important quantity in the system, and the stiffness. So what is vertical stiffness related to? If we think about stiffness is characterized by the change in force over the change in length of this system. So we're just considering the vertical direction for the moment. So we're talking about vertical stiffness. So it would be the change in vertical force over the vertical change in leg length. And that's proportional because we know that in the vertical direction, the animal has to support its body weight against gravity. We know this force is proportional to mass times gravity, right? And we know that we can consider that the leg length, the compression of the leg, right, is going to relate to leg length in some way, right? If we think that in a dynamically functionally similar system, that the overall compression of the leg would be some consistent fraction of the resting length of the leg, potentially, right? So considering these characteristic time periods and the parameters involved in them, McMahon and Chang proposed body mass, leg length, and gravity as the set of base quantities for legged terrestrial locomotion from which you can derive your dimensionless quantities, okay? So they propose that if you normalize everything based on this set of base quantities, then you can calculate dimensionless quantities for all of the gait characteristics, and all of the size variation, related variation should collapse, okay? Now this is a hypothesis because, of course, we know that animals don't scale in a perfectly geometrically similar way. And we also expect that they might not function in a perfectly similar way. But this is basically a model-based hypothesis that we can use then to compare our data and see, we can test the hypothesis that the variation collapses when we normalize based on these quantities. So if you work through going through these quantities, all lengths, distances traveled, et cetera, would be normalized based on nominal leg length. We can talk about different ways to measure that, because that is an area that has, you have to make some choices. Forces are going to be normalized by body mass times gravity, mg. Time is going to be, we're going to use the characteristic pendular period as our time base. You can derive time in different ways, and people have argued about that, but we're going to say that because all of the motions, the gaits, are characterized as a spring-loaded inverted pendulum, that inverted pendulum motion is an important component. And in the swing phase, which we haven't talked about, the leg does act as a pendulum. So this quantity is an important characteristic. Frequency is just the inverse of the time characteristic. So it's going to be related to g, the square root of g divided by leg length. And velocity can be calculated as g times leg length, the square root of g times leg length. So if you think about working this out in standard SI units, g is going to be 9.81 meters per second squared. Leg length is going to be in units of meters. And so you'll have meters squared per second squared. And when you take the square root of that, it's meters per second. So to normalize things to dimensionless quantities, you would calculate these values and then divide all of your quantities in SI units by these values to make them dimensionless quantities, okay? These are some of the basic ones. You can also calculate, based on these same reasoning, how to normalize energy or work, right? If we have, I'm using simple terminology that I know Simon won't approve of here, but just trying to keep things basic here for today. Work is energy or work are going to be related times to force times a displacement. And so we can use mgl to normalize energy and work values, okay? One additional quantity I want to talk about, which is used a lot in the literature, is Froude number, right? Froude number is a dimensionless quantity that's based on the ratio of inertial forces to gravitational forces in an inverted pendulum. It's also used something to do with fluid dynamics originally, but I'm not a fluid dynamicist, so I'm not going to get into that. So because inertial forces and gravitational forces are, important for determining those mechanical energy fluctuations. And so without getting into the dynamics too much, I'll just also note that Froude number can be derived by the ratio of kinetic energy to potential energy in the system. And so if you calculate that out, the kinetic energy is body mass times v squared, mv squared. And the potential energy is going to be body mass times gravity times leg length. Body mass cancels, right, because it's on both sides. And so you have Froude number is v squared over g times leg length. And then I'll also just note that the square root of Froude number is v over square root of g times leg length, which is the dimensionless velocity, okay? And so some people use Froude number as the dimensionless velocity, and other people will normalize just using dimensionless velocity. So just note that they are related to each other and they're equal to each other at 1, right? Because the square root of 1 is 1. But they do then differ from each other when you're at dimensionless speeds or Froude numbers away from 1. But the reason Froude number is important is because it is physically impossible for a legged system to walk at Froude numbers greater than 1, because the centripetal accelerations of the point mass rotating about its foot as it does the arc during stance will exceed the gravitational acceleration required to keep the system on the ground, and an aerial phase occurs. So as speed increases and approaches Froude numbers of 1, the system naturally starts, an inverted pendulum system naturally would fly off the ground unless there's some actual anchor to keep it on the ground. So that would require an additional force. Okay, so now we're going to get to data. So I want to tell you a little bit about the data. If you haven't already, I'd encourage you to download the files from the shared drive to your desktop if you actually want to look at the data. I'm going to be using MATLAB. Some of you may not have experience with MATLAB yet, so I'm going to just walk through and run it. But you can also try to run the MATLAB code on your own computer if you do have MATLAB. So we have data from ground birds over a 500-fold range in body mass from our own study. And we've also compiled literature data from 21 different additional species that span a size range of 2,500, okay? So I'm gonna just pause here and stop sharing so that I can show you some of the data and give you a minute to open the files and have a look around yourself. I'm gonna just stop sharing that. And while you're downloading the data, does anybody have any questions or discussion points? No. Okay.
No,
So
I want to see the data in action.
see the
I want
data.
to see it applied before I.
Okay, we're going to do the application. Okay, so how to best do this? I've got a ton of windows, but first, let's see. If you go to, I might just have to share my desktop to make this. Sorry if I'm not looking at the camera for a bit. I'm going to share my whole desktop and hope there's not some weird stuff in the background. Do you see this whole screen here right now? Okay. And so we have a folder with the workshop materials, and everybody can you see the folder that I'm highlighting? It's hard because I don't see what you're seeing. So, okay. So we have a folder. The first thing I'd like you to do is open the Byrne-Jeffrey Daley Table 1 and double click on that, open it up. And, oh, I already have it open. So I have it here. And this basically just it's the metadata for all of the compiled data sets. And it shows the author, the year it was published, the common name, species name, classification, and some morphometric data that we're going to be using to calculate our dimensionless quantities. Okay, so most importantly, body mass and hip height. Now, one thing that has been debated in the literature is how to measure leg length in terrestrial animals consistently, because standing hip height is the standard way to do that. But as I noted earlier, there's a change in posture with body size. And so measuring hip height confounds a body size effect and a posture effect in one measure, right? And so one thing that people have questioned is whether it's appropriate to use hip height or, for example, some of the segment lengths as the standard length. And so in the paper that we got this data from, in the review paper, we analyze multiple possibilities for how you actually characterize leg length. But for today, we're going to use hip height and body mass, just because that's the actual standard approach most people have used in the literature, okay? So this has the metadata. The second data sheet that we're going to be using in the code is called compiled data, SPSL, stride period and stride length. If you open that, you will see that it's an Excel file with a separate sheet for every study that has the speed, stride period, and stride length for every species in the data set. And so the MATLAB script's going to load in all of the data for all of these different studies, but you're welcome to browse and look at the individual study data sets at your leisure, okay? And then the next thing to open is the MATLAB script. So it's called Comparative Avian Scaling, All Birds 25. And you can open that, double click. Can you all see my code now? Okay. So the first thing to do if you're trying to run this on your own computer will be to, within your MATLAB workspace, I'm gonna move things over so that you can see my, oh, I've got things trying to automatically. Okay, is to, in your workspace, go browse to the folder where you downloaded your data to make sure that it's the current directory in MATLAB. So I've already done that. And so I'm just gonna go back here, right? So you should be able to see the data files in the current folder here. And then you can go back to the script. And we're just gonna kind of first operate things cell by cell. The first cell here, it just sets the directory for loading in the data using the functions in this script. So you can just click, if you have this open, you can click run section and it should run the current section that's highlighted. And then I'm going to run the next section. I didn't have time to clean this up because I dug this out of the archives. But what this is doing is reading in the Excel file that has all of the literature gate data summary in a slightly different format than the nice clean data table I showed you. But it has the same basic data. And this, don't worry about the details of this part of the script, but basically what it's doing is it's loading in the metadata as well as body mass, hip height, and the other morphometric variables from the data set, okay? So if you run that block and you've done that, actually, I'm gonna just go. So I'm gonna have a fresh start here so that you can see things appear correctly when I run things. Run this section. After you run that section, you should have some data populated into your MATLAB workspace, okay? And then we're going to load in the individual gate data sets from our spreadsheet here. And that will take a minute because it's big, but it's once you have that, you have even more data in your workspace. But most notably, we have our gate data in SI units in a structure in MATLAB. So here, speed, this would be in meters per second, stride period in seconds, stride frequency in hertz, stride length in meters, and Vmax, the maximum velocity that was observed in the data set. And we also have the normalized gate data, which has been calculated using a function in the MATLAB code to normalize all the data into dimensionless quantities using the quantities that I went through in the presentation, okay? And so now we will have the same variables, but they're in dimensionless quantities in this one, okay? So next, once it's loaded, we're going to plot the data in SI units and look at the variation. Can everybody see the graph? Okay. So here's the data, and it's color-coded so that the larger animals are in red colors and the smaller animals are in blue colors. The species list is here with some abbreviations. Don't worry about it too much. The really small quail are in blue, and the ostrich data sets are in orangey reds. We're compiling data from multiple studies. What are some observations you can make about this data set? So this is where I want people to actually get a little bit more interactive because I've been talking too much. What observations do you make about the data if we're comparing across species here? So we have stride frequency and stride length against speed for something like 21 different species. Anybody going to help me out here?
It seems like they take different approaches to increase their speed based on size.
Yeah, so if you're looking in terms of SI quantities, right, there are certainly differences in the stride frequency and stride length relationships in terms of the slope of each of them with speed when we're looking at in SI units. So any other thoughts? And it's certainly the case that the small animals are operating at absolutely higher frequencies, right? Compared to our ostrich. Ostrich operating at very low low frequencies in SI units, and also has a shallower slope, right? So if we compare the data in absolute terms, you can see that they have different relationships, and also the maximum speed increases with size, right?
Yeah, that was going to be my question. So, like, how do you normalize for maximum speed, right? Because you can only compare so far in body size for the smaller body, and then like you have a much wider range. I mean, the slope is pretty low in the
Well,
stride
this is
frequency in the big
actually,
animal.
it's a little misleading because I've added an exceptionally, the ostrich data set from one of our studies that we've included here has one of the biggest speed ranges recorded because we did it overground outside. And so one of the challenges that we always have when we're trying to compare across species is whether or not the measurements were made in comparable ways, right? And most of these studies were actually lab-based studies. If you ignore, so that like this light red data set, there's actually a dark red data set of ostrich data that's over here, that's a subset of the speed range of the larger data set. And that's the ostrich data that was collected in a lab. So there's basically, it is really a challenge to compare maximum speed across species, because you have to figure out how to know when you've elicited an actual maximum speed, or get them to perform a similar range of speed under similar conditions, which is not really very feasible. So this is one of the big challenges. There's been a lot of work trying to compare maximum speed with body size, but I think there's always challenges with knowing when you have, how you actually estimate the maximum speed. Right.
So could I ask a question about how they got the speed? So let's, like in the stride length, for example, is there more vertical velocity? You know, like
Well,
to
stride
get
length,
that,
this stride length is just based on distance traveled. So it's
right, but how they got that, is there a way to add another dimension to figure out did it end up being more up and down, like the trajectory of the center mass shifted to achieve that? Or I'm trying
well,
to
yeah,
add
I'm
another
showing very
dimension.
simple measures here, and we'll
Yeah,
talk,
yeah.
if we get to it, we'll talk a little bit about that, because
Okay, cool.
there are differences in that, certainly.
The
This
how.
is,
Yeah.
you know, these, and some of that emerges from when we think about things in dimensionless quantities. So let's kind of,
Got it.
looked at this graph, and you can kind of continue looking at it at your leisure, but I'm actually going to add more. So I'm going to go back to our code for a minute. And now in the next section of the code, it's creating a graph where we plot the S data in SI units side by side with the dimensionless quantities to compare. So before I run that, anybody want to guess what it's going to do to the graph? Like, what do you expect to happen? If they were dynamically similar, what should happen?
I expect them to have a similar slope.
Right. So basically, our expectation, based on the dynamic similarity hypothesis, would be if we normalize everything to dimensionless quantities, everything should collapse down onto a single relationship, right? All of the variation should disappear. That's our expectation. And that's basically the null hypothesis that we're trying to test, right? How close do birds get to that full collapse of the data down to these with the dimensionless quantities, right? Okay, so I'm going to run it, and we'll see how it does. Can you see the graph? So what do we think? Anybody want to make some observations? Okay, so now look at the scale. Note, the scale has changed. So on the right, the scale was from 0 to 12 meters per second, and now it goes from 0 to about 3-ish in the data in dimensionless speed. In terms of relative stride frequency, the range is like, 0.1 to 0.8 here, okay? Relative stride length, we have ranges from a little bit under 1 up to around 6, okay? Whereas in absolute stride length in meters, the range was 0 to 6. So that scaling's pretty similar, I guess. But here, right?
I don't know. I would say potentially there's a threshold in leg length where you begin to alter the dynamics because the larger size is different, has a different pattern than the rest.
Well, so what's interesting, so here, what's interesting is that it did collapse down the variation in frequency, and it inverted the pattern, inverted the apparent trend, okay? So where it used to look like, well, of course, small birds use higher frequencies than large birds. Now, you can see in terms of relative terms, the largest bird uses a higher frequency compared to the smaller birds, which are using relatively lower frequency. And in relative stride length, the largest birds using a relatively lower stride length. Now, this kind of gets back to your question, Jill, about the differences in the gait. And if you are using a more vertically bouncy gait, more of your motion in the vertical direction, it tends to correspond with a gait with relatively shorter stride lengths for your size. And so part of this difference in the stride length pattern reflects that difference we observe between small and large birds, that small birds are using a relatively flat center of mass trajectory and minimizing the vertical bounciness, and large birds are using a very vertically bouncy center of mass trajectory. And so we could use model-based simulations and analysis to try to understand what that means in terms of the functional consequences for the differences in gait. But it's interesting that ostriches have pretty exceptionally high relative stride frequencies, and people have speculated that that's because, I mean, they're exceptional across the board. If you compare them to humans, they use much higher stride frequencies. And people have speculated that that's why they're the fastest bipeds, because they have basically some well-developed elastic mechanisms in the leg that allow them to not only cycle elastic energy during the stance phase, but use some of that elastic energy to like catapult the leg forward for the swing phase, so that they're using sort of like elastic catapult mechanisms to help achieve higher stride frequencies and cycle times compared to animals that don't have those mechanisms.
So just I'm not familiar with a lot of this, but I'm wondering about that time domain and bringing that up, right? Because taking advantage of those elastic properties, I keep thinking of the material properties and how it gives them what you get for the deformation that might be happening, or the spring-like settings, right? Those kind of things. And is that brought into this level, this kind of an analysis, like a third dimension, to see what you just said graphically? Do you know what I mean?
So
I'm trying to bring that in, yeah.
To get to that level, we actually have to do simulations. So
Okay, got it.
So if I can go back to my slides, hold on.
I don't want to take you off track either. I'm just curious. Yeah,
yeah. Transition actually.
Okay, cool.
So I'm going to find my slides and find you again. I've got too many windows going on. Okay, data and code. Okay, so we've seen these graphs now. I put them in here just in case you want to refer to them later. And one of the things, the question is like, how would you interpret the data differently, and what does it mean for function? We do need to get to model-based studies. And also I had a slide in here to prompt us to think about the problems of velocity that measuring comparable ranges of speed that Caitlin brought up, right, is that we do need to consider how the data were collected, right? These are our ostriches, were our ostriches. They're retired now. But we did overground measures for the ostriches. And so if you actually compare the data sets for the ostriches overground versus in the outside versus in the lab, this is what it looks like. So this is a graph from the data where we were looking at walk-run transitions.
We don't see the graph right now.
Oh, you don't see my graph? Okay, I have to. Thank you for speaking up. Jeez. Sorry about that. Okay. So we have to consider how the data were collected. You can see this now, right? You can see my ostriches. Okay. So we collected in the ostriches, we chased them around with ATVs outside to get the high speeds, basically, right? And so we were able to get a higher speed range. In the lab, ostriches are actually pretty skittish, and the humans are cautious because they don't want to get disemboweled by the ostrich kicking them. So there are multiple factors that mean that the range of speed you're going to get an ostrich to do in the lab is limited, right? So you have to think about the conditions under which you collect the data. And here you can see in black X's are the data collected in the lab. And as a relative speed range, it's very narrow compared to the data that we collected over ground. Most of the data that we see is collected in the lab, and so we'll have, depending on the species and whether it's willing to perform in that setting, different speed ranges. But so we got to think about that. But wearable sensors are exciting because we can use those to try to get overground data. So figuring out how to get good quality gait data from wearable sensors is a fun topic to think about as IMSI if we want to measure a diverse range of species and their gait patterns over a range of size. Anyway, so how do we fairly compare species is a question. And then we want to get back to what does all of this mean? Do they have dynamically similar movements? So to answer your question, Jill, to actually analyze what this means in terms of elastic energy cycling, mechanical work, potential, you have to run simulations. So you can do that using the characteristic, here's, like the characteristic gait parameters for each species. You can then use the mass spring model to model the forces as well as the energy stored in the leg spring and the mechanical energy fluctuations involved in the gait that characterizes each of these species, right? So here we did simulations for like a hypothetical range from the 100-gram quail to 100-kilogram ostrich. And the scaling patterns we observe is that, as body mass increases, relative stride length decreases and relative stride frequency increases. If you simulate that and estimate the work done associated with that gait modeled using a mass spring model, these gaits that the small birds use involves much more work in the leg because you're compressing the leg spring more and there are larger fluctuations in the fore-aft forces. Whereas the larger birds have smaller fluctuations in the fore-aft forces. So basically by having a vertically bouncy gait, the vertical fluctuations are higher, but the fore-aft fluctuations are reduced, and that reduces the mechanical work and the potential for muscle work demand during the stance phase. But then the question is like, how does this happen at a mechanistic level? We don't have the measurements from this sort of analysis, right? We'd have to get into, more detailed measures at the level of the, muscle and the tendon and things like that. Does that kind of get at your question that you were thinking about?
Yeah, I keep thinking about the leg, how it's being regulated and where, right?
Yeah.
Especially when we think about context of in humans, we would say ankle, knee, and hip, right? So you can get the same support moment, but do it different ways. And we
Yes.
see it very much regulated, especially in athletes of different sports, because different strategies provide different advantages, these kinds of things. So
Right.
while there's a center of mass displacement, where is that coming from? And especially if we're trying to get to muscle level modeling, I think about that, right? And
Yeah,
the other part of it, as you said, like we did the vector overlays with the person running and the ostrich, is the demand imposed by the reaction force relative to the segment angles will also change that, the magnitude of the net joint moments, for example. So, and then we have other things like where you may have a very big moment, but very little change in angle. So we see this a lot in the leg stiffening, where you have a huge moment at the knee, but no change in knee angle. So there's not going to be a net joint moment work that shows up. So those are the kinds of things like I wonder about. And then
Yeah.
especially when you're pushing limits, right, where you're trying to go get those faster speeds, what can you change? What does the time constraints allow you to? And because we deal with athletes, if you know what those limits are, you then know where to train them to see if you can overcome those constraints. So that's where I was going with the question. I know it gets into a level of complexity, but really looking at that leg trunk action is also an issue where many skilled movements don't just have the trunk upwards. They have a trunk leg action. So the center of mass gets the trajectory you want, but it's a combination of a leg trunk angle that allows it. So that's where I was going with the questions.
Yeah, I think one thing, so kind of like to zoom out here and think about, one of the goals of IMSI is to think about how we integrate understanding across organizational scales, structural scales. And, my analysis and talk today is really the whole body dynamics, and it doesn't get at the mechanisms, but it is really interesting to think about this spring-loaded inverted pendulum model is really what we call a dynamic template model. It's very simple approximation of the gait dynamics, but it's useful for telling us what are the peak force demands and what is the timing of the force demand for a particular gait. And then we could think about then how we integrate from that template model down to the more mechanistic scales where we think, okay, if somebody has different hip strength or triceps serrae strength, ankle strength, how does that influence our ability to exert forces in specific directions, and how might that constrain the gait choices available to them, right? And so I think it's possible to map between these two scales, but then how you do that will depend on your question. I see that there's some questions in the chat that I didn't answer. So I want to get to those too. So,
okay.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. You can go for. You were going to say something, Katie.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of is slightly related to Jordan's question, but slightly different. So this is all assuming like geometrical similarity while scaling, right? So we assume that as leg length increases, body mass is going to increase. But are there any instances where leg length increases? Because that would change some of our dimensionless quantities, right? When body mass doesn't increase, because you're showing body mass and leg length as being kind of not one-to-one, but you know what I'm saying, like as they increase.
Well, the interesting thing is that when you look at Freud number, for example, right, body mass cancels out in the relationship. And so gravity and leg length are the most important quantities there. And so, yes, if you had an animal that increases its leg length relative to its size, that you would want to measure the actual leg length, right? And so then that's where analytical choices have to be made. So we compared in the review article, like, okay, what if you used a leg length that assumed isometric scaling? And how does that compare to if you use hip height, standing hip height? And how does that compare if you use the sum of the segment lengths? Because that represents like your maximum extension. So I think that the choice there depends on your question, because if you use standing hip height, that's a good approximation of like the resting length of this animal's leg, right? And so it's effective leg. But if you were analyzing something like jumping, where the maximum extension of the leg is important, then relevant leg length quantity is probably going to be the sum of the segment lengths instead. And so I've just, we're just scratching the surface here, because when you're doing this kind of analysis, you really do need to think about what are the physics of this task and how can I come up with the right set of characteristic quantities that relate correctly to the physics of this task, right? And so it is different for walking versus jumping, for example, right? You would want to measure different. And there's a related question in here from Hannah. You mentioned normalizing for size. Does this include other anatomical features such as feet? Do you include the foot in the leg length, right? And the answer to that question probably depends on the task, right? Or depends on the posture that animal uses. So, for plantigrade animals, you might argue in walking humans with their foot fully in contact with the ground, then the leg length that they're using is basically like the hip to the ankle. But if you suddenly walk on your toes, you've got to include the part of your leg that your foot that now forms part of your leg, right? And so some people have done things like, if you're characterizing running, for example, there's variation in human posture. Some people are like heel strike runners and some people are forefoot runners. And so what they've done in that case is they basically measure the leg length of the runner at the point where they contact the ground. They actually measure it physically based on their posture in running, rather than their standing hip length or like hip height, right? Because that then is more functionally relevant to the running task. But interesting question is like variation in feet and how that contributes to gait, because but it can't be captured by a simple mass spring model because that model doesn't have a foot at all. Okay, there's a question from Jordan. Or Hannah, do you want to chime in?
Yeah, sorry, I was just gonna say, I don't know anything about really birds. I was looking at the foot while you were talking, and they look like, they're really built to run.
Yeah.
They don't really, I mean, they have a heel, but it's a high arch. So their foot is built for speed, and they have this huge toe. And in humans, the big toe is our aid for balance, and it's our aid for propulsion. So when you look at that, I wasn't, surprised to see that overall they're faster and they have longer strides.
Yeah.
It's, they're just built for that. So I was just curious, I was just at the beach, and you see the seagulls, they're wet feet, they're flat foot, but it's just completely different environments. So I was just curious.
I think that's like foot function is a really important question. Junior is my first year PhD student. His whole thesis is going to be focused on foot function. So I'm excited about that. And I also want to just, add to that like there's some really interesting differences in humans versus ostriches that you can think about. So, and using the dimensional analysis to put things in dimensionless quantities actually helps with that analysis, because once you do that, you can see that humans have a much wider speed range for walking compared to ostriches. And part of the reason for that is because we have this plantigrade foot that allows us to roll the center of pressure forward during stance and basically cheat our leg length when we're walking, so that we can increase the maximum speed we can walk before that critical Froude number limit kind of becomes a problem. Whereas birds, when they're walking, they're not really designed for walking. They have a very narrow preferred speed range for walking, and they transition to running at a relatively lower speed compared to humans. And that's interesting because they really do seem like they're more built and specialized specifically for running rather than walking as compared to humans. We seem to be striking some compromises to be able to do both, economically.
Right. I have another quick question, and I don't want to take too much time, but how would you suggest to scale for somebody with abnormal anatomy?
Can you give an example?
Well, so I study movement in para athletes, and so one
Right.
body typically doesn't look like the next. So
Right.
if I wanted to use this scaling model, how do I start to apply this?
I think you would want to think about what's the effective length of the leg in the like particular activity in question. And so if you were talking about walking or running, that's usually the distance between the center of mass and the center of pressure where the foot or the equivalent of the foot is applying force to the ground. And so you would basically want to measure that distance as the effective leg length, whatever the anatomy looks like in between. Do you agree with that, Jill? You probably have an opinion on this.
Yeah, and I think this is the key piece, right? Is really thinking about in the activity, right? So what are they taking advantage of? You're getting an idea of what, because with para athletes, it's always what they do have, right? And what also gets interesting is the control issues as well, right? In terms of there may be built-in stiffness regulators that become an asset that could be leveraged for depending on what the sport is, right? So look, I think the advice to look in the context of the task is really good advice, and begin there, and then figure out what attributes and characteristics might be advantageous for the physics of the task. So I really agree with what Monica laid out there, which was really nicely done. So I would start there and give a framework and then go from there, because I think that grounds the question.
Yeah.
So we first have to identify from like the most simple high level physics of the task that we can come up with, and then identify what are the characteristic quantities that relate to achieving that task. And then we can think about how that applies to any specific anatomy, right?
I would also think, especially in the context of the foot, is there's going to be mechanical objectives, so what you want horizontally and vertically, but you also need to think about, you may not want angular momentum generation. So angular impulse generation is maybe a negative rather than a positive. And the ability to have the force move along the foot is actually a huge multiplier for angular impulse generation. So be aware of, there may be things you want and there may be things you don't want, and they all have to be satisfied in usually a relatively short ground contact.
Yeah. Okay, I have another couple good questions. So in the chat. So Jordan asked about long necks in birds and how that might compare across species. I haven't measured the necks to say for sure, but one of the things is like with the small birds, the quail, they're very floofy borbs. They look round, but that's all feathers. And underneath, they actually have very long, slender necks. It's just that you can't tell as easily as you can with an ostrich that has more of a, less floofy neck situation. But all birds do use like their stabilizing their gaze, and so their neck and proprioception in the neck combined with vestibular input is being used to control their gaze, which moves relatively separately from the body. And so that's like gets into a whole level of complexity that you'd need a fancier model to be able to address, because we're not really like thinking about the independent control of gaze versus body dynamics. But it's pretty one side note is that birds, unlike all other vertebrates, have a balance sensor in their lumbar spinal cord that allows them to sense and have balance sense of the body independent of the head and neck. And one potential function of that is enabling independent control of gaze, stabilization, and body dynamics. How that emerged and at what point in the evolutionary history of birds is kind of a mystery that I don't know the answer to. And then there's a question, will range of motion affect leg length specifically in runners? And how would we consider limited range of motion? That's a good question. I think leg length emerges from sort of like how far can the inverted pendulum motion of the body, what's the angular range it can achieve during that stance phase? And for humans specifically running, that's going to depend on hip range of motion, but also possibly ankle range of motion as well. Or it depends on whether they're doing forefoot striking or heel striking. I don't know. Jill, do you have a thought about that?
Yeah, and I also, one thing popped in my mind too is what the objective of the task is. Because again, a lot of the things experimentally are steady state. And one of the things we're trying to explore is unsteady state. So things like an acceleration, you may actually purposely put the foot further behind than you might normally swing to, so you can accelerate quickly because you're in a better position to accelerate in the direction you want to go. So this is getting to the force direction being linked to the task. So again, I think it serves you well to say, what are you trying to do? How are you going to take what you have to accomplish it? And then thinking it whole body and then limb level. So I hate to say it depends, but it depends, right?
But we might, it might be interesting to, for example, you could look at, if you were to look at like specialized sprinters versus marathon runners, do you have predictions about how their range of motion would differ at specific joints?
Yeah, because sometimes again, it depends, right? Like, so I worked with horizontal jumpers. They're coming in at 10 meters per second. They basically plant a leg. They can't yield too much, but sometimes they're taking away range of motion because they can't control the range of motion when they're experiencing 10 times body weight on one leg. So if you get into high level sprinters, they don't land on their toes. They're trained to override landing on their toes and landing more flat foot. Partly because they can't control, I would hypothesize, they can't control the moment being applied to the ankle. So you're taking that away because of the way you're interacting with the ground. I mean, if you look at how to train a sprinter, they're actually taking away some of that range that might be available because it can't be controlled. So the context is huge here, right? It's like you have to do the task and you have to control it, the magnitude of loads that you have to deal with whatever the interaction is. And this might be very different if you're like at a springboard, like in diving, you have to apply the load for a long period of time to ride the board versus something if you're doing sprinting where the ground context is shorter and shorter the faster you run. So this is where the time dependency also makes a big difference in terms of how that interaction is achieved. So orientation of segments relative to the reaction force is a big issue. And if you can't control it, usually you avoid it.
It seems like there might be some really interesting relationships between like sprinting and marathon to what you were talking about in the birds earlier too, Monica. So, you know, the analysis that I've read it, which is purely in the popular literature of sprinting, is that the winner takes the fewest steps. That means that they have the longest stride length, and so they have a much bigger range of motion at the hip. And it seems like you know, it seems like there's some similarities to the posture and leg length things that you were talking about with the ostriches versus the smaller birds as well.
Yeah. But Savannah's asked a question that kind of relates to this thinking about gait and trade-offs between stride length and stride frequency, right? If you want to maximize stride length, if you consider the forces required, that does require very large fore-aft forces. And so this can lead to potentially like overuse injuries and things like that too. Because one thing that for people who are prone to like shin splints, often one of the things that the coaches try to tell them to do is increase their cadence. So they're effectively decreasing their stride length and trading off with stride frequency so that they're not exerting such large fore-aft forces when with every stride. And just simply like training people to run at a like 10% faster cadence can sometimes be enough to help limit the recurrence of those injuries. So, but that's with people who are prone to injury. I don't know how that, like, you know, I imagine that there's different trade-offs depending on just like other factors like your relative segment lengths and your proportions and those sorts of things. Like if you're a person who naturally has very large hip muscles and a lightweight distal limb, you're going to probably be one of those people who can naturally do faster cycle times, right? And so there's probably trade-offs in how individuals trade off between stride length and stride frequency based on their own anatomy too, right? That then probably influences what specific events that they're best at.
I think one of the things to think about too, is you think about how we measure lengths, right? It's like toe to toe distance, right?
Yeah.
How do you get that? Well, remember there's center mass flight here, right? So with more vertical velocity, you will travel further before you land. So part of it's the impulse generation and time in the air. And then the other part about looking at the quality of the leg interaction with the ground is, have you configured the segments like foot, shank, thigh, and trunk such that when that force comes back at you, you can generate the set of moments you need to control that interaction. So if you start, quote, overstriding, I would argue that you may be significantly changing the moments that are required to control that leg. When you do the higher frequency, it may also be you're putting your legs in a configuration you can better control the leg. So I don't think sometimes the stride rate, stride length literature doesn't get to the joint kinetics. And I think that's an area where we could probably fill in some gaps.
Oh, interesting. That's an interesting thought. Okay, I think it's time to sign off. So just before everybody goes, I want to show people the surveys to give feedback. So I'm going to just quickly share my screen one more time. For trainees, if you didn't sign in at the start, please go ahead and sign in now. And for everybody else, we'd appreciate your feedback. So you can use the QR code to provide feedback on the workshop.